Hi, I'm Amber O'Hearn, and I'm going to tell you about the Lipivore. You might have heard of the carnivore diet. The idea is that some people can experience drastic improvements in their health by not eating plants and instead getting all their nutrition from animal-sourced foods. This happened to me personally. In 2009, I went from eating a low-carb diet, which I'd been doing for 12 years, to what people are now calling a carnivore diet. I stopped consuming any plants, although I do drink coffee. Well, to make a long story short, I did lose some weight that I had gained while on a low-carb diet. But the most important thing is that my brain healed. I'd been suffering from a mood disorder, which was originally diagnosed as treatment-resistant depression and later re-diagnosed as bipolar disorder. When I stopped eating plants, I stopped having those symptoms and I stopped needing medication. But when people hear the word carnivore, what they often think of is a diet based on protein, because that's what other carnivores in nature do, and because that's how we tend to use meat in our society now in the high-carb world, is we use it as a protein. But when humans are eating a carnivore diet, what they're actually doing is eating a diet that's based on animal fat. There are many things about human bodies that really make us stand out compared to our closest relatives. We have supersized brains. We walk upright. We have a precision power grip. And we have a short digestive tract. Our digestive system is based on hydrochloric acid and is less fermentation based. These are all arguably intimately connected. And they're all connected to another major distinguishing feature of our physiology, our fatness. I'm going to present you with a hypothesis that humans are not only specialized for eating animal foods, but for eating fat specifically. And many of these human-defining features are a reflection of that. Of course, everybody grows up thinking that their way of life is what's normal and everything else is strange. Well, the thing is, all of modern medicine comes directly from people living in grain-based societies. So it's little wonder that our biases about human physiology center around high-carbohydrate diets. But in fact, grains are extremely new. If this circle represents all of our time as anatomically modern humans, then that sliver is about how long we've had grains. And if you look back further through our history as the genus Homo, then that sliver becomes even smaller. So what were we doing all that time before grains? A common mistake is to think about our history as being well modeled by our closest living relatives. That would be chimpanzees. But as you can see, the last time we had a common ancestor with chimpanzees was over 5 million years ago. A lot can happen in 5 million years. I'm going to call these two trajectories the Homeline and the Pan line, just for ease of speaking. But notice that the Homo genus starts after the Homo line, and the Homo line includes Australopithecus, which lived after the divergence of that common ancestor. People like to emphasize the similarities between these two lines, but it's our differences that are critically important to understand. And just as an analogy, think about the hippo. The hippo's closest living relative are cetaceans, the whales and the dolphins. Granted, they split a lot longer ago than we split from chimps, but the point is that closest doesn't always mean close. Their physiologies are completely different. In particular, hippos are herbivores and dolphins are not. What I'm going to describe now draws heavily from this anthropology paper from last year. In this paper, Dr. Thompson and her colleagues draw some critical distinctions between behaviors that we now see in the Pan line and what archaeologists find in the Homo line. What chimps do now is they supplement their diets, which are largely herbivorous, with small prey. They can do this because it's done by hand, so the hunting itself is done by hand, and then the eating of that carcass is done with their teeth, not with tools, and they happen to still have large canines for tearing flesh. They don't have a lot of carnivore competition because this is done in the forest, not out in a terrestrial open area. And what they get from all that is an excellent high-quality source of protein and micronutrients, which is really good for them because that is lacking somewhat in their diets otherwise. On the other hand, what we know that Homo did until quite recently was hunt very large prey. It sounds like it's just a matter of size, but there are important qualitative differences. So to take the animal down, they needed to have flaked stone tools. And to deal with these large carcasses of meat, they needed flaked stone tools to butcher them as well. They were out in the grasslands where there is a lot of competition from large carnivores, and that presents a danger. And then, of course, what they get out of it is not just some protein, which is really valuable, but something that turns out to be even more valuable, and that is large deposits of fat. It's not just that the animals are larger, and so they have a linear kind of expansion of fat tissue. They actually have more fat tissue, in general, mammals, more fat tissue proportionally out of all of their mass, the larger that they get. So this made a big difference. The human origin story has been focused for a long time on this entry of Homo with our great brains, coming into being having stone tools with which to hunt large game and get high-quality food in the form of meat. And that is quite true. But the story has a bit of a chicken-egg problem. Just because it doesn't explain how all of that got started. You can't get the meat and use it without having the tool. And this tool is actually pretty technologically complex. It requires simpler tools to make. But there's no reason to devise this complex tool if you aren't already going after large prey, but only small prey, because you didn't need those tools for small prey. So it becomes a complex inference to suggest that these two innovations came into being simultaneously when they're so interdependent. The implicit idea has always been that large prey hunting was just a sort of natural expansion from small prey hunting. But as we've already seen, these just aren't in the same league. It's not just a matter of size. It takes different behaviors. It takes different tools. It takes different physical adaptations, and then it gets you something different in the end. The insight from Thompson and her co-authors is that it's much more parsimonious to start with something that we almost certainly already had. So these pictures are later examples of the same thing. It's a technology that's really primitive, and all you really need is grip. Interestingly, this function of gripping and smashing is thought to be the most likely selective pressure for the particular shape and characteristics of strength that our hands have, and that the whole Homeline had. In fact, the structural differences between our hands and chimps' hands were already happening as far back as Australopithecus. Chimps today use percussive tools. They use them to get into nuts, for example, and early hominins probably did that too, like is being depicted here. What Australopithecus was probably doing, that chimps definitely don't do, was scavenging for bones and skulls and breaking into them with these percussive tools. These are the parts that are left over because carnivores can't typically get into them. Percussion is great because it gives us access to this inside bone nutrition. It's fat. It's high energy. If you're talking about inside the skull, you've got brain-specific nutrients because, of course, what's in the brain is what the brain needs. It's got persistence more so than the meat on the outside of bones because it's sheltered, being encased in these bones from bacterial infection, so to speak, so that the safety of eating it lasts for longer. And it's portable in the sense that early hominins started already having adaptations to be able to carry more loads, carry them farther. And so if they were able to carry this tool and have it while they're foraging, that enables them to have greater access to things they're finding. Or, on the other hand, they could pick up bones and skulls and take them back to a tool site and then use them from there. But the funny, fortuitous thing is that percussion tools give off flakes as an accidental byproduct of their use. This actually happens to chimps when they're using them, but they don't seem to pay any attention to it. Presumably that's because it's irrelevant for their purposes. But imagine if you're working with some bones. You've got this carcass that has a bit of meat attached to it, and you're trying to get inside it with a percussive tool. And as you're working with it, over and over, the very thing that would actually help you make use of that meat keeps dropping into your own lap. Eventually you're going to notice. So now we suddenly have a compelling, succinct explanation of how we got to the hunting stage. Once we're in a position that we're already regularly relying on large animal carcasses as an important, significant part of our foraging strategy, and we're regularly coming into contact with something that helps us butcher meat that's sometimes attached to it, it almost seems inevitable that this progression would happen. And it has nothing to do with small prey hunting. It doesn't happen from the small prey hunting. It only comes through that scavenging pathway. And remember, the impetus here is fat. The gateway is always fat. So that's our first cornerstone. We've got the homopredatory pattern of fat seeking that's bootstrapping the brain growth, the intelligence, the use of tools, and the going after meat. So now let's look at something else. What's so special about fat? For humans as we are now, fat isn't just convenient and easily digestible. It's one of only 2 choices that we've locked ourselves into as a species that have these properties. If we look at herbivores and carnivores, they're both getting most of their energies in ways that we don't have the ability to make very much use of. Specifically, herbivores eat grass and leaves and other plants that are mostly fiber. They don't technically digest this because no vertebrate animal can digest fiber. But certain parts of the digestive tract can house microbes that actually do digest fiber, and the result of that digestion is fat. It's a special kind of fat, short-chain fatty acids, and that's what herbivores use for energy. This diagram shows that there are only a few different places in general digestive tract that vertebrate can have these fermentation centers. If you look at ruminants, they typically have a fermentation chamber ahead of the stomach in the digestive tract. So that would be like your cows who are said to have 4 stomachs, for example. It's not really stomachs, it's a place for fermentation. Other kinds of herbivores typically have them after the small intestines, so you have the colon and the cecum that are providing this function. Our closest relatives do this. You can see that more than half of their digestive tracts are devoted to colon and cecum, and less than half to the stomach and small intestines. Whereas for us, it's less than a fifth, actually, that is our colon, and the cecum is so small you can barely see it on this chart. The importance of this is that you can't go back from that point. To have made that physiological change is a commitment on a species level to getting most of our energy from something that is not fiber. So we're not doing it the herbivorous way. What about the carnivore way? We've been called top carnivores by people who are studying bone isotope analysis. What that's about is that there are chemical traces that build up in bones every time one creature eats another. And so the higher up the food chain you are, the higher those concentrations are. Analyses like these show that Homo ate very high levels of meat, and probably we ate other carnivores as well. This puts us unambiguously at the top of the food chain. The levels we see in Homo are so high that some researchers have a hard time reconciling that with their other views about our diet. So for example, this researcher who was working on the problem called it an unreasonably huge amount of meat. And if you're not sure what she means by this, we can see that her advisor said something much more explicit, which is, this doesn't make sense from the point of view of human nutrition, because if you're a hypercarnivore, you starve from an imbalanced diet. Well, obviously I disagree with that statement, having eaten an unreasonably huge amount of meat for over a decade. But that's a different presentation. But they are right in a sense, because if we're thinking of meat as just protein, humans actually do have a problem with high protein intake. We have historical records of what happens to people when they have access only to protein. It's called rabbit starvation because a rabbit is a perfect example of a small prey, and small prey have too much protein relative to fat on their bodies. So Stefansson, for example, the Arctic explorer, described it. He said, rabbit eaters, if they have no fat from another source, beaver, moose, fish, will develop diarrhea in about a week with headache, lassitude, a vague discomfort. If there are enough rabbits, the people eat till their stomachs are distended, but no matter how much they eat, they feel unsatisfied. Well, that's a reflection of the fact that as humans, we derive satiety on a carb-free diet from fat, and protein by itself is just not going to cut it. There are lots of descriptions like this, not just from explorers, but you can also look at literature about modern hunter-gatherer groups who are actually known to throw away game that they've hunted if they find that it's too lean. This is in contrast to other carnivores that have much higher protein tolerances. Take cats, for example. They can actually get up to 70% of their energy from protein. That's because they use protein as a source of glucose to feed their brains. And they're optimized to do it like this. Even if they don't get enough protein, or even if they happen to have the availability of fat or ketones even, they don't stop making enough glucose to provide their brains with fat because that's what they're evolutionarily adapted to. This is very different from humans who really can't make use of that much energy coming from protein. It causes them problems even if they get more than half of that amount. The title of the thesis that I'm taking this from is very suggestive. It shows that what likely drove the mass extinctions of the fat megafauna, the wild animals that were large enough to have the right proportions for us of fat, those animals were driven to extinction by us very likely, and because of that, the wild animals that we're left with now are only the ones that were too lean to bother with hunting so aggressively. Okay, so we've got limits to the amount of energy we can get from protein. We've got limits to the amount of energy we can get from fiber. The only alternatives are carbs and fat. We have an abundance of carbs now, of course, but remember, this is relatively recent. Some people have made arguments for underground storage organs, that is, tubers, making up this difference during that large evolutionary past. But it's really not realistic. First of all, we didn't have widespread use of fire for cooking until a couple 100,000 years ago, which is far too late for most of the brain expansion important contribution to evolution that this matters for. And without cooking, we couldn't release what little glucose these typically have. But more importantly, tubers generally have high levels of toxic compounds that prevent us from relying on them without extensive processing. The consequences of relying on tubers for energy can be really severe even today. And unfortunately, the effects are actually even worse whenever you're in a situation where you're suffering from malnutrition, from not getting enough high-quality protein and micronutrients. So the idea that we could have relied on those extensively is really not very realistic. So these energy constraints on fiber and protein that are physiologically imposed and the environmental constraints on carbohydrates really leave us little room for any other hypotheses about where we were getting our energy than the animal fat long after our bone scavenging beginnings. There's one more piece of evidence that's staring us in the face, and that's how fat we are. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I'm not just talking about obesity. I'm talking about how fat lean people are. So think of the leanest human that you can imagine. It's probably a male bodybuilder. Compared to other primates, even that person has at least 2 to 3 times as much fat as a primate of otherwise comparable adulthood and strength would have. And that's nothing compared to a baby, right? Human babies are notoriously fat, and it's normal and healthy. Other primates don't have this. The fat that they have is not like an obese human. It's almost exclusively subcutaneous. It's distributed differently, and it has a different fatty acid profile. The use of this is essentially correlated to brain energy use. So this paper was exploring different hypotheses for why babies are so fat. And I'm showing on the left a chart where there are some different mammals and how fat they are when they're born. Notice that we even outdo baby seals for how fat our babies are. There aren't chimps on that graph, but chimps also come in like the baboon at about 3% fat. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, it's the percentage of oxygen uptake that's going to the brain. So I've highlighted a human at birth and a human adult and a chimp adult. The point is that all that fat has got to be there for a reason, and the most plausible reason that researchers have come up with is that it's supporting the energy requirements of this very large brain that we have. Of course, humans have a lot of brain. This is a chart showing the encephalization quotient for primates, which is a measure of how big an animal's brain is relative to their bodies. Humans are up at the top right, far above the other great apes, far above the pan line. But you can see the Homo line was progressing above the pan line even before they died out. It's actually about 2.5 times as large as chimpanzees, the humans, and that echoes the fatness factor. But again, those are adults. If you look at babies and their encephalization quotient, as it were, their brains are even bigger compared to their bodies than adults. More than half of their energy goes to running their brains. So where are they getting all this energy? There are 3 things that go together in babies, in human babies. We have larger brains than our adults, we have more fat than the adults, and they are more ketogenic. This graph is from George Cahill, and so it's measuring how much blood ketones we develop after we stop eating. You can see that the newborn baby doesn't even start at 0. I hypothesize that the reason for that is that all of the people afterwards that are included in this study are already eating something that's anti-ketogenic. But regardless, babies do it better than adults, and adult humans actually do it better than other species. Ketosis is actually really important for infant brains. This table is from a paper summarizing some of the evidence we have about the role of ketones in infant brain development. So, for example, energy, like we talked about, before and after birth, ketones supply a lot of the energy needs of the neonate. We also know that there are medium-chain fatty acids in breast milk, and one of those in particular, octanoic acid, which is also called caprylic acid, you might recognize it from coconut oil, is one that we know that babies take up rapidly and metabolize. This last one, even though it's not last in the chart, I chose to show it last because it was surprising to me when I first learned it. Ketones are actually what the brain is made of. See, the brain's made of fat and cholesterol, of course, but the blood-brain barrier prevents most of those from getting through. And so ketones act like a transport form of fat that goes across the blood-brain barrier and then is used to reconstruct fat and cholesterol to make the brain out of. The thing to understand about ketosis is that in other species, it's an adaptation for starvation. But in humans, it really transcends that. You'll hear or read papers that are talking about ketogenesis, and even now they'll often have an introductory section that describes what ketogenesis is, and they'll say it's a adaptation for an alternative fuel for when we're starving. But that's really an outdated view, in my opinion. In rats, starvation can be shown to be adaptive because, for example, the enzymes that allow ketones to be used as energy in the brain increase in their amount and in their activity under starvation. But at least according to Stephen Cunnane, that's not the case at all in humans. In humans, those enzymes are already as active as they're going to be and as abundant as they're going to be, whether you're starved or not, because your brain is always ready to supply energy to itself via ketones. The only limiting factor is supply, and the brain will take up just as much ketones from the blood as there are circulating. But we're also different in supply. Humans are unique among the species as far as I know, as far as I've studied. I've looked at, for example, migrating birds, bears, camels, felines, cetaceans, dogs, and rodents. Some of these animals use ketones and some of them don't, but humans are the only ones that I know of that can reliably get into deep ketosis with no calorie restriction whatsoever, and not only full protein needs met, but sometimes as much as double as our minimum protein needs. No other animal that I know of does this. We know this, for example, we used to think that in order to get therapeutic levels of ketosis for example, for epilepsy, we had to go on a very limited protein diet, limited in protein, I should say, sometimes also limited in calories. But we now know that many people are able to get seizure relief with no limitations on protein at all. If we tell them to eat a low-carb diet that's high in fat, they will end up eating a lot more protein than if we restrict it, up to 30%, but that still doesn't limit the efficacy of the diet for seizure control for most people, and most people are still in mild ketosis. That's very, it's very telling, I think. To generate ketones, it doesn't just require having a low carbohydrate level, but it requires high levels of circulating fat. If you're not ingesting fat, or you didn't just ingest it at a given moment, then you have to get it from your fat stores. And the amount of fat that you can release into the bloodstream at one time is directly related to how much fat you're carrying on your body. So that means the more fat that you're carrying, the more ketogenic capacity that you have. So it's my guess that the reason that we as a species are so fat, even as adults, is exactly to support high levels of ketosis. If you're really lean, like a chimp, I would predict that you wouldn't be able to support a brain of our size with just ketones in an ongoing way between meals while you're fed and while you're growing. The secret behind the magnificent human brain starts with a simple tool that allowed us to diverge from our closest relatives, diverge in the way that we forage for food from animals. The supply of fat that we got was so central to our behavior that we were able to safely drop our reliance on fiber, even though our genetic history didn't allow us to replace that with an ability to make use of protein for energy, and even though the carbohydrate sources were limited and unreliable. To make this transition, we developed an enhanced ability to store fat, to generate ketones, and to use them not just under starvation conditions, but under mundane, non-starving conditions. Therefore, I dub the human the Lipivore. Thank you.
Nice talk from Amber. She's been carnivore for a long time, 11 years. So it certainly doesn't look too unhealthy, does she? A couple of interesting things. I mean, we're fatter than baby seals. I mean, that blew me away. I thought baby seals were full of fat and blubber.
Yeah, well, and to be fair, though, we certainly make up for it with our brain size. And I think the key point that Amber's making quite effectively there is that our brains rely on a ketogenic state, which is essentially an intake of fat. So, our brains are quite literally made of ketones, which is, I think, quite incredible. And when she presented some of the data on newborns, more than half the energy in a newborn goes to running the brain. And obviously a lot of that energy comes from ketones.
And breast milk, as we know, is full of fat. And basically breastfed babies are pretty much in ketosis, aren't they?
Absolutely, and certainly she showed that in the graph there of how quickly newborns can enter ketosis. I mean, that's... and it makes logical sense. The ketones will cross the blood-brain barrier and be reconstituted into fats, which build the brain. So in that phase of life when the brain is undergoing absolutely rapid growth, state of ketosis is very, very desirable. But I certainly think that Amber's really hit the nail on the head there, that we certainly shouldn't fear fat, and certainly as far as our mental health go, and full credit to Amber for bringing this to the forefront, the state of ketosis is certainly desirable.
And of course, we tend to wean babies off onto, the high sugar content food, and we lose all the benefit of that ketosis.
I mean, this is just amazing. I mean, we all know the story of Professor Tim Noakes and the hassles that he got after a tweet talking about baby food. But the simple fact is, if you go and have a look at the aisle in your supermarket on baby cereals and things like that, they'll sort of say, supplemented with added iron and folate and so on and so forth. Well, if it was actually a real food, would you actually need to have everything supplemented? I think we've really moved away from our weaning diets, perhaps of what we may have evolved to consume.
Yeah, you just see so many ready-made packs and so on for infants and toddlers that are just full of sugar and grains, really. And, that can't be healthy after being in ketosis all this time and having healthy breast milk, and all of a sudden they get weaned onto the exact opposite.
I struggle to see where our dietary guidelines, they make this distinction at 2 years old. Well, there seems to be a point in time where full-fat milk is recommended, and then all of a sudden, snap, and we start to recommend low-fat products and low-fat milks. And I just wonder, it's just so arbitrary and nonsensical, and I personally don't understand how it's become so well accepted.
Well, there's certainly no science behind it. That's clear. All the science says that that full fat is much healthier than low fat. That's all obviously a throwback to those to the Ansel Keys days and the dietary guidelines and the obsession with fat that has ruled Western society for the last 40 years with disastrous consequences. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. An interesting talk.